watching NotesIn9.
Hello, welcome to NotesIn9. I'm David Leedy. Episode 158, Introduction to the Frostillicus Framework. You don't win friends with salad. Okay, just a couple of quick updates before we get into the show. The latest on the iOS 8 and the XPages update, or I guess I should say the XPages mobile controls problem update, is there was a tweet made by an IBMer and saying that they are working on it. A fix is coming, and we should hopefully see something soon. I hope, and it's going to probably be Dojo 1.4, I believe the tweet mentioned. So we'll see. So here's hoping. I'm sure they're working on it. I was always sure they were working on it. So it's just good to get the feedback to know that yep, they got this. So hold out there, and it's coming. IBM Connect Ed is around the corner in January, and the call for abstracts has been extended a couple days, so there's still a little time to get that in, at least as I film this. It ends, I think, on October 15th, 2014. So if you want to speak at IBM Connect, and I highly recommend that if you wish, go for it and get your abstract in. My hackathon's continuing. I'm talking to people. I'd like to talk to you. If you're working with XPages, I'm pretty sure that we could find some topic for you to do in the show. It does not have to be all that advanced. Just has to be something that works for you, really, because that might help somebody else. So if you're interested in contributing to the show, please drop me a line. My next contributor sent me a video in a larger format than normal. Normally, I try to get the show out in 1280 by 720, which is 720p, because I just think that's very that works on all devices pretty well and it's easy to see. But his came in a little bigger, and I've done this before. We've gone bigger, and it kind of sucks to do demos and use Designer in 1280 by 720. So I'm thinking of trying to change the normal format or the normal output of the show to 1920 by 1080. So I might experiment with that over the next couple shows here and there and stuff like that. So if you do have any problems viewing the show at that resolution, please let me know. And if all goes well, then I'll try to make that I guess the default standard, and quite honestly, that'll just allow for more room on for Designer and stuff to see things, less scrolling for myself or the contributors. I'm just a little worried about how it might look if you can still see the code on smaller monitors. I assume no one's really watching the show and looking for the code on a phone or anything like that. So again, we just need to test it, and if you have any feedback, I really would appreciate it. Okay, in today's show, Jesse comes back, and Jesse Gallagher is a great XPages developer. His website is Frostillicus with a dot in front of the U, which is a Simpsons reference, I guess. And he works at I Know Some Guys, where he's does programming and development and on-site stuff and off-site mentoring. So if you have any problems or you need help, you can certainly contact him. He's on Twitter at Gidgerby. He's a brand new OpenNTF board member, and one of the key members. There's a bunch in the team, but he's a key member of the OpenNTF API, and he's a prolific blogger, and he's done a lot of really good stuff in the Java space, especially in XPages. With his framework, which is what he's going to talk about today. Jesse has this, framework, which is kind of a way to improve your Java XPages use and kind of formalize it in a way. And while it may seem kind of like a drag to try to use that word formalize it or so, I think if you make the leap and get there, as Jesse has discovered, it may really benefit you, because you're putting code, and it looks like you're putting validation and stuff maybe in better places. So watch the video and check it out. Now, one of the things that Jesse has in his framework is the controller piece, and that piece in particular I've pulled out. So the whole framework that he demonstrates, I've not quite grasped that myself yet. But the controller piece to me is key, and that has really changed the way I do my XPages development, and we're going to talk about that on some future shows, just that piece. But the video that he presents here with this framework, where he goes into the model classes and can drop in just validations simply and declare managed beans or so, is very interesting. So I highly recommend you check this video out. And if you have any questions, let Jesse know, because for God's sake, I won't be able to help you on that. So with all that being said, let's go to the demo.
Hello. In this video, I'd like to give an overview of the Frostillicus framework project, which is something that I've kind of cobbled together relatively recently and represents a plugin framework version of the various classes, tips and tricks, and bag of tricks that I use when I'm creating a XPages project, at least a greenfield XPages project. This isn't the sort of thing that you'd use if you're modernizing an old Notes app or something like this. This is for if you're creating a new fresh application. The framework kind of grew out of an older project that still exists called the XPages scaffolding project. The scaffolding is an NTF that I had previously used that contained most of this code I just use to create it, and I've since moved it out into a plugin, both for organizational purposes and also to add some new features that were not so easily added in an NTF or even possibly added at the NSF level. So I've rebranded it, not the GitHub repository, but I've rebranded the newer work as the Frostillicus framework, for lack of a better term. Frostillicus being the name of my blog. There's a dot in front of the US, and if you're not aware of what it is a Simpsons reference and nothing more. So I've put together a really basic app. I'm using the One UI layout. I'm a fan of using custom renderers for layout, so my normal apps will generally not use One UI, but we use a lot of the same components. The idea here is that it's essentially like a project task tracking system, where you'll have a list of projects and give them names, and they have tasks. So there's nothing really fancy here. At the data level, it is really just a standard NSF. I've kept the data in the same database as the application, which I normally do not do, but works for the purposes of presentation. So I'd like to go over why I use this framework and what makes it different from normal XPages development. At the basic level, a lot of the components are the same. If you look at the home page, it looks, this is standard XSP. It uses an XC, a custom control layout, much like you'd have in a standard XPages application. I use a lot of the idioms from the extension library example application, and the basics here are pretty standard. You may be familiar with the controller classes. These are part of the framework. There's something that I like to do, which is, in order to move a lot of the code out of the XPage itself and into Java, not necessarily because Java is a particularly amazing language or that server-side JavaScript is particularly terrible as a language, but because it makes for much better structured applications by moving your code away from where you have essentially the presentation layer. So you can see here I use a lot of fairly standard things. I have my own data sources, which I'll get into, but again, they're just data sources. I use navigation rules, I use form tables and widget containers fairly regularly. So let's take a look at this project page, which is, you might see this in a very standard app, which is a view containing projects listed by name. This is backed by an actual view, projects all, just by name. So if you go into the projects list, you can see that I use a view panel here, pointing to project for the individual one. I use view columns in a standard way. It pulls in the column names, so it's pointed very much like to a domino view, but instead it's to this model list data, pointed to the manager named projects and the key of all. This is a Java class in the back end that it calls itself projects and knows when you say give me all, it knows to go to the projects all view. So I'll give you an example of what this is. This is diving into the model framework portion. There are several components of the framework. The model objects are one of the newer ones, and they're kind of fast becoming the heart and soul. So the model is, if you're familiar with the idea of model objects, generally they're a way of representing your business objects, project, task, note, to do, whatever, as object with rules about what you can and cannot do to it. Normally in an XPages app you do these as domino document data sources, and you just enforce your rules everywhere where you use those data sources. You could move them out into, you can move the code out into script libraries to make it a little better, but effectively you're always dealing with the domino document directly, and it's up to the code on the XPage to enforce the rules. The reason why you'd use a model framework like this is to kind of push that to the side, where the XPage just says, all right, give me projects, give me the name of the project, I want to set it to this, whatever. You don't have to worry about enforcing any rules on the XPage. That's the job of the model object. So if you look at a standard model object in my framework, it extends this abstract domino model class, basically saying this object is backed by a domino document, and it gets a lot of the same attributes of that. You can store basically anything in it. The framework is all based on the OpenNTF Domino API, so you can really store basically anything as long as it's serializable in the document, and it comes through nicely. And this means that much like with a standard domino data source, you don't have to write getters and setters for every single field. So I don't have to write, public string get name and public void set name to a string of name. I can, if I would like to, and my model framework works with those. But the idea here is that as much as possible, I want to make my code not only as simple as possible, but also as similar to standard XPages code. I don't want to have a lot of boilerplate and make it really, really difficult to dive into this. I want to make it so that when you want to move from, I'll call it the legacy way of doing data access in XPages to using this, I don't want to make it burdensome, essentially, and both for myself and for anybody using it. So a model object has there are a couple boilerplate things because this is Java. So it has these inherited constructors for the different ways that you can get an object. In the model framework, view entries and documents are sort of merged together. It tries to be smart about, okay, if the item is in the view, it does that, and it only opens up the document if it really needs to. So the code on the XPage side doesn't really need to care if the object came from a view or if it came from a document directly. It just does what it needs to do, and the model framework handles it in the most efficient way that it knows how. You can see here when it's the database constructor is basically saying I want to create a new one, so it sets the value of form to project. If you're familiar with data object, the interface, you may have seen it in Tim Tripkini's video a number of months ago, where he talked about a very similar model framework that he had put together. He used data object as well as one of the standard interfaces in XPages for representing map type things, where you say it has key value, that sort of thing. My model objects implement this, and so a lot of the data access is generally done via get value, set value. This is done both for the models themselves and for the collections. You can see here, I'll get to it later, a special type of getter which overrides, rather than just going to the tasks field on the document, it instead gets a list of tasks associated with the project, which will be for a bit later. You can add in events that happen. It's basically post-save code. This is equivalent to the data source post-save document event, but done directly in the model. And you can see what you have here is called a manager. It's a little, at first, it's a little counterintuitive, but basically this is what allows code to fetch these model objects. On their own, the model objects are just a class saying, I will be given a view entry, or given a document, or given a database. The manager is actually what gives that and allows querying of views and getting by ID and all that sort of thing. So these come from abstract domino manager. There's a bit of stuff here saying like what's the class supposed to be, what the view prefix is supposed to be. You can see here that's projects all. And the result of this is that I end up with a managed bean. One nicety in the framework is that I've added a version of the annotations from future versions of JSF or future relative to XPages, so I don't have to go into Faces config to say I want to manage bean, name projects, and it's this class and it's this scope. I can do that directly in the code, and the app knows how to look for these and finds it and instantiates them as much like you would with a normal managed bean. So basically what this is saying is that there's a manager for projects called projects. It could be anything else, and it knows how to get project objects from the database, the current database, from the view. And so you can see that in use. Where I have my model list data, the manager name is projects. That just matches right up to the managed bean name. And the key is all. So it's saying tell the projects manager, give me all of them, and the project manager knows, okay, that's the view prefix is projects, and give me all, and it just basically returns a representation of that view. It's backed by a view navigator, is very similar to the Domino view data source, and it presents it in a way that's compatible with view panels, which not the fanciest type of visual representation, but it'll get the job done here. It works very much the same way. So you can see here, there's, you have the same, that's your column, and it's all done like you would in a complete new thing. So you could say, all right, give me a new project. This is done on the project form itself. Again, this is fairly similar to a standard way that you'd have it document, but instead of a Domino document, you're saying, give me a model object, manager name similar to before, and here I'm using a little fancy expression language. What this is saying is, if there's a ID parameter in the URL, then use that. Otherwise, pass the key of new, which the manager knows to mean create a new model object in the specified database. So in this case, since I've just gone to the project directly, it's basically, this is effectively new document. If I go back here and go here, you'll see ID, and it's opening up the existing document. So this is similar to action equals open document, action equals new document, or that sort of thing. Personally, I'm not a fan of that kind of thing in the URL, but so I do this, but there's no reason you couldn't have code that did something similar. So here again, form table, form row, it's binding to the same thing. Binding to project.name, and remember there's no reference to project.name on here, so you don't have to specify every single field. I could make up a completely new one, project.body, project.summary, whatever I wanted, and it would bind, much like you would with the Domino document. There's not that much overhead when you're working with these projects. And so the basic, kind of CRUD operation is there. Create a new one. It added this message. This is the code that you saw in the post save, where it says add message confirmation project saved successfully. Framework utils is it's my version essentially of xlab-util. Add message, all this really does is add the specified string to a view scope, or a flash scope variable rather, called confirmation message or error message or what have you. And it's basically a way of displaying messages when you're going in between pages. Flash scope is another thing that it's one that I picked up a while ago. Unfortunately I forget the name of the person who originally posted it, but in the project itself I have a reference to that. But flash scope is essentially like a request scope that exists between two pages. So you go from one page to the other. Flash scope exists for that one following one, and not thereafter. So you can see here when I created it, on this load it says project saved successfully, but if I refresh it's gone. So that's a way of saying, that's a message in between two pages when you're navigating between them. So there are a couple other things. So say I create a new project, name, I leave it blank. I have not specified any rules for this. So okay, that's blank. Oh, there it is, and I can't click on it. This is presumably something we've all run into at some point or another. And so this brings up other little things that I've added to this framework. For example, I've added a converter for blank values. So you can go to converter and say convert empty value. You can specify what it should be. If you leave that blank, it will by default just say empty. So now I can say, all right, if it's empty, display as this instead, so that the link will still be clickable. And that will work with any value. That's not anything specific to the model framework. But really, I don't want projects with empty values. That's not something that should be illegal. So what I can do here is, this is a relatively recent addition to the model framework, which is that I've brought in, you may be familiar with it, a project called Hibernate. It's about Java persistence, and it builds up a lot of those things. There's a sub-project there specifically about validation. And so what I've created the ability to do is to do private instance variables that have these validation annotations. So I can say private string name, and right there it doesn't really do anything because it's just sitting there called name. But if I add this annotation, which is one of the Hibernate annotations, saying this should not be empty, which means it should not be null and it should not be a blank string. So now if I go back and try to resave this, now that it is in a legal state, go and save, now I get a message saying this may not be empty. Note that I've added nothing to the XPage. This is not done via a validator. This is not done by setting required equals true. It can be, you can work with that as well. It works great. But in this case, this is enforced at the model level and does not have to be done on the XPage itself. This is another way where this way you don't have to worry every single time you have an XPage creating a project that you are checking this specific value. It's just done. And if you look up the Hibernate project, there are many validators. It's not just about emptiness. You can specify string lengths. You can specify, I believe, like number, min and max. There are some custom ones specifically for email addresses and credit card numbers and all this sort of thing, where you don't have to write your own validator for every single type of thing. You can just add it at the model level, and it's done. This would work if you're creating the objects in an XPage or completely via Java, or as I'll get to in a bit at the end, via REST. So this is just one of those things where it's something that would have taken a lot of code or a lot of attention to detail elsewhere, and it's just done once, and now that's clear. And it's clear in the model object what you mean, saying this has a property called name and it's not empty. So it's clear what's going on. Now, I had mentioned tasks. So tasks, as you might expect, projects have many tasks. So I go to one of these and I say, let's see, I think there are some that have tasks already. Yeah, so it's an embedded view similar to the view on the previous page, but what's interesting here is how I get to that list of tasks. So here I have a view panel, and the value is project.tasks, project being effectively my document. So normally with a Domino document, .tasks would refer to the field tasks, which would be string, number, whatever. But in this case, it's actually calling the getter in the project class saying get me tasks, and what this does is get the manager, which is similar to this for tasks, saying get me named collection by project ID, which is the view, and the category is the ID of this document. And so just by doing project.tasks here, this is similar to if you had a view panel where it was a Domino view and the category filter was the project ID field of the ID of the project document. But here you don't have to. And more importantly, you get back a list of task model objects, not Domino view entries or Domino documents. And so each of these tasks could have whatever special behavior I'd like associated with them. And it's all just done transparently. If I wanted to, like if there was a single task and it had notes attached to it, I can chain these together because it's EL. That's not set up here, so that wouldn't work. I can do things because it's returning a list. I can say this should only show up when there are tasks. So not empty is another expression language ism, basically saying in expression language empty means it's not, if it's null or if it's empty string or an empty list. So in this case it's saying if it's not an empty list, then display it, otherwise hide it. And it's just, this is a nice little expression language thing that's built in that I rather enjoy using. And you can see here the same convert empty value I've been using previously. So when I can make a new task, and this will be a task attached to the project and attached to here, and it's pretty straightforward. Again, similar to what you do in a normal application. There's a little more going on with the, whoops, I forgot to change that to say task, but there's a little more going on with this page than with the previous one, because it's attached to, when you're doing new task, it's attached to a project by default. It has this list of project names, that's the blank one, and so it's a little more complicated. And this is where controller classes come in. Controller classes are basically, I like to think of them kind of like how you have HTML and you have CSS, or you have HTML and you have JavaScript. With controller classes, I like to think of the XPage as the HTML, the theme as the CSS, and these controller classes as the JavaScript. So you don't want to put all of your JavaScript code on the HTML directly. You want to just reference it as necessary. And similarly with controller classes, you don't want to put all of your code on the XPage directly because it gets to be a mess. You want to reference it as necessary, and you want to do it in as smooth a way as possible. So there are a couple things that go on in this class. So I attach to the after page load event of the XPage and say, okay, now get me the task, which is defined as a data source, much like the project is, and look for the project ID. If it's a new task, look for the project ID in the URL and then set that. So this way I don't have to have code on the XPage saying, okay, this is the parent ID. This is similar to how you'd have, parent document ID or whatever the parameter is. but it's done here in a slightly different, more Java-focused way. Additionally, this drop-down list is being pulled from Java. If you can see on the task page, you can see select items. The value is controller, which is the implicit name for the controller associated with the page, and it gets project options, which just goes to get to project options. This is not the prettiest way to do it, but all I'm doing here is just getting, this is effectively a DB column from the projects all, which is, this is a very old style notesism. This isn't necessarily how I do it long term, but it worked in this case, which just gets me a column that's the name and the UNID. So, and it returns here, it returns a list of strings. I could have done select items or really any of those other things that you would do in server JavaScript, but just done a little cleaner. So this page doesn't need to know how to get the list of projects. The controller's job is to get the data from one place into the XPage. It's not the XPage's job to go fetch that itself. So that's, I guess there's one more word about controller classes, which I had mentioned that the controller classes are implicitly named. And what that means is a lot of what I like to do when I'm coding is kind of go by convention. And in this case, I could have it, and I originally did when I was first doing these, have it so that there's like a data object or a data context on every single page saying, all right, this class has, this page has a data object called controller, and it's, a new, Frostillicus dot, app dot controller dot task or whatever. But I realized that for the most part in NSF, you want to know where to put things. So for example, models, I just put in a package called model because these are not shared between apps. So for controllers, it goes even a little further, which is that as soon as you can create a class called controller slash whatever your controller dot whatever the name of the XPage is, it's automatically picked up by the app and put into that. Very much like a managed bean, but different for every single page. And you don't have to put these as managed beans, so you don't have to fill up your faces config or use these annotations to say, okay, this is the task page controller, the project page controller. It's just implied saying, okay, if there's a class by this name, it then creates it and attaches it as needed where it can, and it's just there. So you don't have to worry about adding a bit of stub code to your XPage. It's just done. And this is because this is all done because of this convention where you don't have to worry about where all the code is. You just say, all right, if you have controllers, they're in the package controller. If you have models, they're in the package model. It's just done. It both saves a little cognitive overhead and a little bit of code, and it also makes it a lot easier to take a look at another app, because there's a tendency when you're not following these conventions to just kind of do everything a little different every single time. And so the more that you can settle on a standard way of doing things, the easier it is for you to go back and look at an app you wrote 6 months ago, or for someone else to come in and look at an app you wrote to work on a team saying, all of our models are going to look like this. All of our all of our tasks or all of our controllers are going to look like this. And that goes through it in a number of other ways, and I expect I will expand on those other ways in future videos. And to close, I'd like to cover on one thing I'm fairly excited about. I blogged about this recently, and it's kind of the culmination of one of the things I wanted to do with my model framework, which is that, alright, so I have this model framework, and I'm using Java instead of server JavaScript, and I'm using my own model objects instead of Domino documents. That's all fine and good. Like, having validation is nice, but a lot of the time, conceptually, if you're not used to this sort of thing, that may not be enough to sell you. And I hope that the side benefits are, and one of those side benefits is that because you're defining your models in a standardized way, you get REST services for free. I've made it so that every database now, if you go to fmodel, it'll work with the same defined managed bean names and the same keys to look up and say, all right, give me all of the projects, and you get JSON that looks basically like you get from the Domino data access service. But again, this obeys all of the rules from the model object. So if you had a custom getter for name that translated it in some way, that would be called. When you post a new document or put on top of an existing one, it will go through the same validation. Like if you try to put a new project that has a blank name, it will fail because the validation says that it has to have a non-empty name. This happens no matter what the client is, whether it's the XPage, whether it's Java, whether it's this REST service. So you can go through and say, okay, give me all tasks by project ID. This is not the prettiest syntax. I plan to work on this, but all tasks by project ID for this. And this is basically a way of saying, give me all of the tasks associated with the project. So in this way, you're not just building an app that works with XPages. It's not just an XPages app. What you're doing is you're building an app saying, this is my project task management app. One of the UIs is an XPages app that happens to be in the same NSF, but it's also this REST application. So you can build a iOS app, you can build a Angular JS app that uses this, and it's all, you're still building all of the same rules. You have the same backing data sources, which happen to be a Domino database in this case, but down the line could be Couch, it could be SQL, it could be a text file on the server, whatever you want to do. And they all have the same the same backing store, the same rules, the same semantics. All of this is the same collections. And suddenly, it's not just, okay, I need to make this X page and I need to make a button that does this. Now you're building out this app that's built around the data that, like I was saying, it's like the heart and soul of it. You're building it around these data objects. And I hope that you can sense that I'm very excited about this sort of thing. I've been working on this a lot recently, and I plan to have some more build some more features into it, and I hope to be able to have some more videos to cover some of the other aspects of the framework. Thank you for your time.
And that's the demo. If you have any questions, again, contact Jesse, and I thank Jesse for coming back on the show. He's a great friend of NotesIn9 and a great friend of me personally. And if you have any questions for me, here's my information, and I thank you for your time.